She was 3 days from death and 2 days from a hanging if the posse caught her. The Wyoming winter of 1886 wasn't just cold. It was a killer that snapped trees like matchsticks. Abigail had one bullet left in her stolen revolver and a choice: use it on herself to end the freezing pain, or break into the smoke-belching cabin at the edge of the timberline. She chose the cabin. But when the door opened, she didn't find salvation. She found a man with eyes like a wolf and a skinning knife in his hand. She had nothing to offer him but a desperate lie and a domestic truth. This is the story of how a single whispered promise changed the fate of the West. The blizzard howled like a banshee through the Tetons, a white curtain that erased the world. For Abigail Ross, the numbness in her toes had stopped being painful hours ago. Now, it was just a terrifying absence of sensation. She stumbled, her boots, cheap leather, ill-fitted for this altitude, crunching through the crust of snow. She clutched the canvas sack to her chest as if it contained gold. In a way, it contained something more dangerous than gold. It held the ledger that would hang the most powerful man in Laramie. But Tobias Finch wasn't her problem right now. The hypothermia was. Through the swirling white, she saw a flicker of orange. Fire. A chimney. She forced her legs to move, dragging her hem through the drifts. It was a cabin, built of rough-hewn pine logs, dark with creosote and age. It looked less like a home and more like a fortress built to keep the world out. Abigail didn't knock. Her hands were too frozen to make a fist. She threw her shoulder against the heavy oak door. It didn't budge. Panic flared, hot and sharp. She tried the latch, her stiff fingers fumbling. It lifted. The door groaned open, and she fell inside, collapsing onto a floor made of packed earth and bare skins. The heat hit her like a physical blow. The smell of burning cedar, stale tobacco, and curing meat. She gasped, trying to fill her lungs, but a shadow fell over her. It wasn't a shadow. It was a man. He was massive, filling the frame of the dim room. He wore a coat made from a buffalo hide, the fur still thick, and his face was hidden behind a beard that looked like tangled wire. In his right hand, he held a skinning knife, the blade dark with old stains. He didn't yell. He didn't ask who she was. He just stared, his eyes the color of gunmetal gray. "Get out!" he rumbled. His voice sounded like gravel grinding together. "Before I throw you out." Abigail tried to push herself up, but her arms trembled and gave way. "Please," she croaked. "The storm. Storm kills the weak," he said, taking a step toward her. "Not my business." He was lethal. She could see it in the way he held the knife, loose, ready. This wasn't a man who herded cows. This was a man who hunted predators. "I have money," she lied. He laughed, a dry, humorless bark. "Money don't burn hot enough to keep you alive out here, girl." He reached down, grabbing the collar of her threadbare coat. He was going to drag her back into the snow. Panic gave her a surge of adrenaline. She scrambled back, crab walking across the furs, her back hitting the rough logs of the wall. She looked around desperately. The cabin was a mess. Unwashed skillets piled high with grease, tins of beans rusted shut, a layer of grime over everything. It was the den of a man who had forgotten how to live and was only surviving. She saw the cast iron stove in the corner. It was cold, save for the fire in the hearth. A sack of flour sat open, weevils crawling on the rim. He loomed over her, his hand reaching out again. "I can cook!" The words came out as a whisper, strangled by her fear. The man froze. His hand hovered inches from her face. He tilted his head, the firelight catching a jagged white scar that ran from his temple into his beard. "What?" Abigail swallowed hard, her throat clicking. She looked at the grime, the neglect, the raw venison sitting on a bloodied table. She looked him in the eye, channeling every ounce of desperation she had left. "I can cook," she repeated, her voice gaining a fraction of strength. "You have flour, you have meat, but you're eating dried tack because you don't have the time or the patience. I can make biscuits, gravy, coffee that doesn't taste like mud." The man stared at her. The wind shrieked outside, rattling the door on its hinges. For a long moment, the only sound inside was the popping of the cedar logs in the fireplace. He looked at her hands, red, raw, shaking. He looked at the hollows of her cheeks. He knew she was running. He knew trouble trailed her like a scent. Elias Graves had spent 10 years as a tracker for the U.S. Marshals before he walked away from the blood. He knew a fugitive when he saw one. But then his stomach growled. A low, traitorous rumble. He hadn't eaten a hot meal not made by his own scarred hands in 3 years. Slowly, deliberately, Elias sheathed the knife at his belt. He reached down, but this time he didn't grab her collar. He grabbed her hand. His grip was calloused and hard, but surprisingly warm. He pulled her to her feet with effortless strength, pulling her close enough that she could smell the pine resin and old whiskey on him. He looked down at her, his face inches from hers. The threat was still there, simmering, but curiosity had taken the lead. "Biscuits," he said, testing the word. "From scratch?" "Yes," Abigail breathed. "Lard, if you have it. I have bear grease." "That works better," she said, her instincts taking over. Elias held her gaze for another second, searching for the lie. When he didn't find one, he let go of her hand. He walked to the door, slammed the heavy bolt home, and turned back to her. "Stay," he said. The command hung in the air, heavy and absolute. "I need you to fix that stove." He pointed to the cast iron beast in the corner. "You make a meal that's edible. You sleep by the fire tonight. You fail. You sleep in the snow. Deal?" Abigail nodded, her knees shaking. "Deal." "Name's Elias," he grunted, turning his back on her to stoke the fire. "Abby," she lied. Her name was Abigail, but Abby felt smaller, safer. "Well, Abby," Elias said, tossing a rusted skillet onto the table with a clang. "Cook!" The first hour was a test of will. Abigail's fingers were so stiff she could barely hold the handle of the skillet. She had to rub snow on them first to get the blood flowing, the pain agonizing as the circulation returned. Elias sat in a rocking chair made of bent willow wood, sharpening his knife. Scritch! 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 The sound was rhythmic, predatory. He watched her every move. The kitchen supplies were abysmal. The flour was lumpy, the salt block was nearly gone, and the only leavening agent was a jar of sourdough starter that smelled like it had turned to vinegar. But Abigail Ross had been raised in a boarding house kitchen in St. Louis before her mother married Tobias Finch and dragged them to hell. She knew how to improvise. She rendered the bear grease down until it was clear liquid gold. She sifted the weevils out of the flour using a piece of clean cheesecloth she found in her pocket. She revived the starter with a pinch of sugar she found in a tin. The cabin began to change. The smell of stale smoke and unwashed man was slowly replaced by the scent of browning meat and rising dough. Elias stopped sharpening his knife. He sniffed the air, his nostrils flaring. Abigail found a slab of cured ham hanging from the rafters. She sliced it thick, frying it in the skillet until the edges were crispy and the fat had rendered out. She used the drippings, mixing in the flour to make a roux, then added water from the bucket near the door. It thickened into a rich, pepper-flecked gravy. She worked in a trance. Cooking was order. Cooking was chemistry. It was the one thing in her life that made sense when the world was falling apart. When she plated the food, 2 tin plates, dented and scratched, she felt a wave of dizziness. She hadn't eaten in 2 days. She placed the plate on the small table between them. "Eat," she said softly. Elias stood up. He loomed over the table, looking at the food with deep suspicion. The biscuits were golden brown, steaming in the cold air. The gravy smothered the ham thick and white. He sat down. He didn't use a fork. He picked up a biscuit, tore it open, and dipped it into the gravy. He took a bite. Abigail held her breath. Elias chewed slowly. His eyes closed for a brief second. A sigh, almost imperceptible, escaped his lips. It was the taste of civilization. It was the taste of a memory he thought he had buried along with his wife and son 5 years ago. He opened his eyes and looked at her. The hostility in his gaze had dialed back from a 10 to a 6. "It ain't poison," he grumbled. "High praise," Abigail murmured, sitting opposite him. She reached for her own biscuit, her hand trembling. He watched her eat. She ate like a starving animal trying to be polite. Small bites, but swallowed quickly. "Who are you running from, Abby?" The question was sudden, sharp. Abigail choked on a crumb. She coughed, reaching for the tin cup of water. "I told you," she wheezed. "Just traveling. Got separated from my wagon train." "Liar," Elias said calmly. He didn't stop eating. "Wagon trains don't run through the Tetons in November. Passes are closed. And you ain't dressed for travel. You're dressed for a Sunday social." He pointed his knife at her chest. "And that coat. That's a man's coat. Too big in the shoulders. Blood on the left cuff." Abigail froze. She looked down. There was indeed a dark stain on the gray wool. Tobias's blood. From when she had smashed the whiskey bottle over his head to get away. I stole the coat," she admitted. "From a drunk in Virginia City." "Virginia City is 200 miles south," Elias said. "You walked 200 miles in those boots?" "I caught a ride. Part of the way." Elias wiped his plate clean with the last of the biscuit. He leaned back, the wood of the chair groaning. "You're in trouble, girl. Bad trouble. I can smell it on you like smoke. Does it matter?" Abigail asked, her voice hardening. "I made the meal. We had a deal. I sleep by the fire." Elias studied her. She was small, pale, with hair the color of dried wheat that had come loose from her bun. But her eyes, green and sharp, didn't flinch. She was terrified, but she wasn't broken. "Deal's a deal," Elias said. He stood up and walked to a pile of furs in the corner. He kicked them toward the hearth. "Sleep there. Keep the fire fed. If you let it die, you freeze." He walked to the single bunk built into the wall. He placed his revolver, a massive Colt Peacemaker, on the crate beside his head. "And Abby? Yes, I sleep light. You try to take anything from this cabin. You try to take that gun, and I'll put you out in the snow before you can blink." "I won't," she whispered. Elias blew out the kerosene lamp, plunging the cabin into the orange glow of the embers. Abigail curled up on the furs. They smelled of musk and pine, but they were warm. She watched the silhouette of the mountain man in his bunk. He was a monster, she decided. A solitary, rude, dangerous monster. But he had let her stay. She closed her eyes, exhaustion pulling her under. She didn't see Elias propped up on one elbow, watching her. Elias wasn't sleeping. He was thinking about the flyer he had seen in the trading post at Bannack 3 weeks ago. A reward poster. Wanted for grand larceny and attempted murder. Abigail Ross. Reward, $500. Issued by Marshal Hiram Cole. Hiram Cole was a snake. Elias knew him from the old days. If Cole was hunting this girl, she wasn't a criminal. She was a victim. But Elias had sworn off saving people. Saving people got you killed. Just tonight, he told himself. She stays tonight. Tomorrow, the storm breaks, and she goes. But as the wind howled outside, burying the cabin in another foot of snow, Elias Graham knew that tomorrow wasn't going to be that simple. Morning broke with a silence so profound it hurt the ears. The storm had passed, leaving the world sculpted in blinding white diamond dust. Abigail woke to the sound of metal clicking. She shot up, gasping. Elias was standing by the window, peering through a crack in the shutters. He held a Winchester 1873 rifle, the brass casing gleaming in the morning light. "Get down," he hissed, not looking at her. Abigail scrambled off the furs, crouching low. "What is it?" "Riders," Elias said. 3 of them, coming up the valley floor. Abigail's blood ran cold. Are they lawmen?" "Not wearing badges," Elias muttered. "But they're riding government horses. Big bays, shoed for ice." He turned to look at her. In the daylight, his scars were more visible. A map of violence etched onto his skin. "You recognize them?" Abigail crawled to the window, pulling herself up just enough to peek through the slat below Elias's elbow. She saw them. 3 dark shapes against the snow, about a half-mile out. The lead rider wore a long duster coat and a flat-brimmed hat. Even at this distance, the way he sat in the saddle, arrogant, slumped to one side, was unmistakable. "It's Silas," she whispered, her voice trembling. "And the O'Malley brothers. Who is Silas?" "He works for my stepfather. He's a cleaner. A cleaner!" "He cleans up messes. People. Problems." Abigail turned to Elias, gripping his arm. "If they find me here, they will kill you. They won't ask questions. They'll burn this cabin down with us inside." Elias looked at her hand on his arm, then back at the approaching riders. He calculated the distance. Maybe 10 minutes before they reached the tree line. "Why?" Elias asked. "Why send 3 hired guns for one girl?" Abigail hesitated. She knew if she told him the truth, he might hand her over to save his own skin. $500 was a lot of money. It was enough to buy a new life. But she looked at his eyes. Beneath the gruff exterior, there was a code. She had seen it when he ate her biscuits. He respected effort. He respected survival. She reached into her canvas sack and pulled out the book. It was a black leather ledger, bound with twine. "This," she said, "my stepfather is Tobias Finch. He runs the mining consortium in Virginia City." Elias raised an eyebrow. "Finch owns half the territory. He's a rich man. He's a thief," Abigail spat. "He's been altering claim deeds, stealing gold from prospectors, changing the survey lines, having the owners killed if they complain. This book, it's his real accounts. It proves everything. It proves he ordered the murder of the city surveyor last month." Elias looked at the book. It was dynamite, literal dynamite. Possessing that book was a death sentence. "You stole it?" I took what was mine, she said. He married my mother for her land. When she died last winter, he said I was next, said he'd marry me to keep the deed in the family. Her voice cracked. I took the book to ensure he couldn't come after me without risking the noose. I didn't think he'd send Silas this far north. Elias looked back out the window. The riders were closer now. He could see the rifles in their scabbards. He looked at Abigail. She was shaking, but she wasn't crying. She was holding that book like a weapon. Elias Graham had spent the last 5 years hiding from the world, punishing himself for the family he couldn't save. He had told himself he didn't care about justice anymore. But Tobias Finch, Elias knew that name. Finch had funded the cattle war that had killed Elias's brother. The universe, it seemed, had a twisted sense of humor. Elias racked the lever of his Winchester. Clack, clack. "Stow that book," he ordered. "Hide it under the floorboards beneath the stove. Then get in the root cellar." "What are you going to do?" Abigail asked, her eyes wide. Elias turned to the door, his face settling into a mask of cold indifference. "I'm going to invite them for coffee," he said. "Get moving. Now." Abigail scrambled to the stove, prying up the loose board she had noticed while cooking. She shoved the ledger into the dark earth. Then she ran to the trapdoor in the corner of the room, threw it open, and lowered herself into the darkness. "Stay quiet," Elias said, "no matter what you hear." He kicked the rug over the trapdoor. He took a deep breath, checked the load in his Colt, and unbolted the front door. He stepped out onto the porch, the freezing air biting his face. He leaned the rifle against the rail, within easy reach, and crossed his arms. The 3 riders slowed as they approached the cabin. The lead man, Silas, pulled his horse up. He was a nasty piece of work, pockmarked face, a bowler hat, and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Morning," Silas called out. His voice was oily. "Morning," Elias rumbled. He didn't move. "Lost our way in the storm," Silas said, dismounting. His hand drifted near his hip. "Wondering if you've seen a girl pass this way. Small thing. Blonde." Traveling alone, Elias spat into the snow. "Ain't seen a soul in 3 weeks. Just wolves." Silas walked closer, his spurs jingling. The O'Malley brothers stayed on their horses, their hands resting on their saddle horns. "That so?" Silas sniffed the air. "Smells like biscuits. Friend. Fresh ones." Elias didn't blink. "I cook," Silas laughed. "A mountain man who bakes? That's a rare thing." He stepped onto the porch. "Mind if we come in? Warm up? Maybe sample that cooking?" "I mind," Elias said. "I don't like company." Silas's smile vanished. "We're deputies, friend. Working for Marshal Cole." "I don't see a badge," Elias said. Silas's eyes narrowed. He looked at the rifle leaning against the rail. He looked at the size of Elias. "You got a name? Hermit?" "Graham." Silas paused. The name meant something. A flicker of recognition and fear crossed his face. "Elias Graham? The regulator?" "Retired," Elias said softly. Silas took a half step back. "We heard you were dead. Died in the panhandle." "You heard wrong." Silas looked at the cabin door, then back at Elias. He weighed the odds. Elias Graham was a legend with a gun. Even 3-1 weren't great odds if the one was Graham. "Look," Silas said, his voice tighter. "We don't want trouble with you, Mr. Graham. We just want the girl. She stole something valuable. You give her up. There's $500 in it for you." Elias stared at him. "Told you. Ain't seen her." Silas stared back, his eyes searching Elias's face. Then, slowly, he backed down the stairs. "All right," Silas said. "Maybe we made a mistake." He mounted his horse. "But we'll be camping down the ridge. If you remember seeing her, you let us know." "Ride on," Elias said. The 3 men turned their horses and rode back toward the tree line. Elias watched them until they disappeared into the pines. He knew they didn't believe him. They would circle back. They would wait for nightfall. He turned and went back inside, bolting the door. He stomped on the floorboards. "You can come out!" Abigail pushed the trapdoor up, her face covered in dust. "They're gone?" "For now," Elias said. He picked up his rifle and began loading fresh cartridges into the tube. "But they'll be back tonight, and they won't be knocking next time." He looked at Abigail. "Pack your things, Abby." And pack the skillet. "We're leaving? We're hunting," Elias said darkly. "If Silas is here, that means Finch is getting desperate. And I don't like men who hunt women on my mountain." He pulled her close, his hand gripping her shoulder. The intensity in his eyes made her breath catch. "You said you can cook," he said. "Can you shoot?" Abigail swallowed. I hit a tin can at 20 paces once." Elias pulled a heavy revolver from a holster hanging on the wall, a Schofield .45. He pressed it into her hands. It was heavy, cold, and smelled of oil. "Learn fast," he said, "because tonight we're serving lead." The sun dipped behind the Grand Tetons, painting the snow in shades of bruised purple and blood red. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was tight as a drawn bowstring. Elias moved with a calm economy of motion that terrified Abigail more than the shouting would have. He wasn't frantic. He was methodical. He overturned the heavy oak table, dragging it in front of the door. He smashed out the glass of the two small windows, clearing the jagged shards so they wouldn't splinter into their eyes when the bullets started flying. "They won't come straight at the door," Elias said, his voice low. He was stuffing extra ammunition into the pockets of his buffalo coat. "Silas is a coward. Cowards like fire. They'll try to flush us out." Abigail sat on the floor behind the overturned table, the heavy Schofield revolver resting in her lap. It felt like a cannon. "I don't know if I can kill a man, Elias." Elias paused. He looked down at her. The firelight flickered on the sharp angles of his face. "You don't shoot to kill, Abby. You shoot to stay alive. There's a difference. You see a shape in the dark. You pull the trigger. You let God sort out the rest." He handed her a box of cartridges. "If I go dry, you hand me that pistol. Don't fumble it." "I won't." Night fell like a hammer. The wind died down, leaving a silence so heavy it pressed against Abigail's eardrums. She could hear her own heart thumping against her ribs. Crack. The sound was sharp, like a dry branch snapping, but it was followed instantly by the thwack of lead hitting the logs of the cabin. Splinters sprayed across the room. "Get down!" Elias roared, diving behind the wood stove. A volley of gunfire erupted from the tree line. Bullets chewed into the door, punching through the wood and ricocheting off the stone hearth. The noise was deafening. Abigail curled into a ball, covering her ears, screaming silently. Elias popped up, the Winchester leveled. He fired 3 shots in rapid succession. Bang! 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 A scream echoed from the dark. "1!" Elias counted grimly. "Come on out, Gream!" Silas's voice drifted from the darkness, distorted by distance. "Send the girl out, and we walk away! Come get her!" Elias shouted back. He looked at Abigail. "Reload the rifle." He tossed the Winchester to her and grabbed his Colt. Abigail's hands shook, but she remembered what he had shown her. Gate open, brass in, gate closed, lever. She worked the action, her fingers slipping on the cold metal. "They're moving," Elias hissed. Flanking left. He moved to the window, firing blindly into the shadows. Then, a flicker of light appeared in the dark. A torch. "Roof!" Elias yelled. "They're going for the roof!" A flaming brand arced through the night sky, trailing sparks. It landed on the cedar shakes of the roof with a dull thump. Another followed. "We have to go," Elias said, his face grim. "Now! Into the snow?" Abigail cried. "We'll freeze!" "Better frozen than roasted." Elias grabbed her arm, hauling her up. "The root cellar. There's a drainage tunnel. It comes out by the creek bed. It's tight, but we can fit." The smell of smoke was already curling down from the ceiling. The dry timber, seasoned by years of heat, was catching fast. Elias kicked the rug aside and threw open the trapdoor. "Go! Take the ledger." Abigail scrambled down into the dark hole. Elias handed down the weapons, then dropped a heavy canvas sack, supplies he had packed earlier. He took one last look at his home, the only sanctuary he had known for 5 years, and dropped into the hole, pulling the trapdoor shut above them. The tunnel was a nightmare. It was an old drainage ditch, dug by prospectors years ago, shored up with rotting timber. It smelled of wet earth and rats. They crawled on their bellies, the freezing mud soaking Abigail's stolen coat. Above them, they could hear the muffled roar of the fire consuming the cabin. They emerged 50 yards away, tumbling out into the icy slush of the creek bed. The cabin was a torch now, flames licking 30 feet into the air. The heat was intense, even from here. Silas and the remaining O'Malley brother were standing by the front porch, silhouettes against the inferno, guns drawn, waiting for their prey to run out the front door. "They think we're cooking in there," Elias whispered. "My horse!" Elias. They didn't find the lean-to. Hidden in a thicket of spruce behind the cabin was a rough shelter. Inside, a massive roan stallion snorted, terrified by the smell of smoke. "Easy, Samson," Elias soothed, slipping into the dark structure. He saddled the horse with practiced speed in the pitch black. He mounted, then reached down for Abigail. "Up!" He swung her up behind him. She wrapped her arms around his waist, burying her face in the fur of his coat. "Hold tight," he warned. Elias kicked the horse's flanks. Samson exploded out of the thicket, snow flying. They galloped away from the firelight, plunging into the black abyss of the forest. Behind them, shouts erupted as Silas spotted the movement. A few erratic gunshots cracked through the trees, but they were wide. They rode hard, the branches whipping at their faces, the cold wind tearing the tears from Abigail's eyes. She clung to Elias, her anchor in a world that had turned violent and chaotic. She could feel the muscles of his back working as he guided the horse through the treacherous drifts. They didn't stop until the glow of the burning cabin was nothing but a memory, swallowed by the mountains in the night. They rode until the moon was high and silver, illuminating the valley floor like a ghost world. The adrenaline had faded, replaced by a bone-deep chill that made Abigail's teeth chatter uncontrollably. Elias felt her shivering against his back. He pulled Samson to a halt beneath the shelter of a limestone overhang. It wasn't a cabin, but it was out of the wind. "Down," he commanded, his voice rough but not unkind. Abigail slid off the horse, her legs so numb she collapsed into the snow. Elias was there instantly, catching her. "Walking warms you faster than riding," he said. "Gather wood. Small stuff. Keep moving." He stripped the saddle off Samson and rubbed the horse down with a handful of dry moss. Abigail stumbled around, gathering twigs and dead pine branches. Her hands were useless claws, but she forced them to work. Within 10 minutes, Elias had a fire going. He built it small and hot, shielded by the rock wall so the light wouldn't carry far. He spread a blanket on the ground near the flames. "Sit." Abigail sat, holding her hands out to the heat. The pain of the thaw was excruciating. Elias opened the canvas sack. He pulled out a tin of coffee and the skillet Abigail had insisted on packing. "You saved the skillet," she said, a weak smile touching her lips. "You said you could cook," Elias grunted. "Hard to cook without iron." He scooped snow into the pot to melt it. They sat in silence as the water boiled. Elias made the coffee, black, thick, and bitter. He handed her the cup. "Drink. It'll shock the blood back into you." Abigail took a sip. It was awful, but it was hot. "Thank you," she whispered, "for saving me. You lost your home because of me." Elias stared into the fire. He took a long pull from his own cup. "Wasn't much of a home. Just a place to wait for death." "Why?" Abigail asked. The question hung in the air. "You're not an old man, Elias. You have skills. Why live like a hermit?" Elias looked at her. In the firelight, the scars on his face seemed to soften. He looked tired. Not physically tired, but soul tired. "I used to be a marshal," he began, his voice low. "Down in the New Mexico territory. I was good at it. Fast. Hard. I thought I was bringing law to the lawless." He poked the fire with a stick. "I had a wife, Clara, and a boy, Thomas. They lived in Santa Fe while I was out chasing bad men." Abigail watched him, sensing the tragedy coming. "There was a gang," Elias continued. "The Darkley brothers. I hunted them for 6 months, killed 2 of them, brought the other 2 in to hang. I thought I'd won." He paused, his jaw tightening. "The youngest brother, he escaped the night before the hanging. I was out celebrating with the boys, drinking, thinking I was a hero." Elias looked at Abigail, his gray eyes shining with unshed tears. "He didn't run for the border. He went to my house. He waited for Clara to put Thomas to bed." Abigail gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "I found them the next morning," Elias said, his voice void of emotion now. "The boy, he didn't suffer. But Clara," he shook his head. "I killed the man who did it. Caught him 2 days later. I took a long time doing it. But it didn't bring them back. And it didn't change the fact that I wasn't there. I was a lawman for everyone else, but I couldn't protect my own." He looked at Abigail. "So I came north, where there were no people, no law, just cold. Cold keeps the ghosts quiet." Abigail moved then. She shifted across the blanket and reached out, taking his large, scarred hand in hers. "It wasn't your fault, Elias, wasn't it?" "No," she said fiercely. "Evil men do evil things. You blame the shield for the arrow's strike." She squeezed his hand. "You saved me today. You didn't know me. You owed me nothing, but you saved me." Elias looked down at their joined hands. Her skin was pale and soft against his weathered hide. "You made me biscuits," he muttered, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. The tension broke. Abigail let out a small laugh, which turned into a sob. She leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder. "I can make better than biscuits," she said. "If we get out of this." Elias stiffened for a moment, unaccustomed to the contact. Then, slowly, he relaxed. He put his arm around her, pulling her closer to the heat of his body. "Stay," he whispered, echoing his words from the cabin. "Stay close. It's going to be a cold night." They sat like that for a long time, the fire crackling. For the first time in years, Elias didn't feel the crushing weight of loneliness. He felt a spark of something else. Purpose. "Where are we going?" Abigail asked eventually, her voice sleepy. "Cheyenne," Elias said. "There's a federal judge there, Judge Holloway. He's an honest man. He was a friend of my father's. If that ledger is real, he's the only man in the territory who can bring Tobias Finch down without getting bought off." "Cheyenne is a week's ride," Abigail said. "Then we better start early," Elias said. But the morning brought a new twist. As the sun rose, Elias climbed the ridge to scout their back trail. He lay on his stomach in the snow, using a brass telescope he kept in his saddlebags. He swept the valley floor. He saw the smoke from his ruined cabin miles back. He saw tracks. But it wasn't 3 horses anymore. It was a column. Elias counted. 10 men, heavily armed. And riding at the front wasn't Silas. It was a man wearing a long shearling coat and a pristine white Stetson. Elias cursed softly. He slid back down the ridge to where Abigail was packing the saddlebags. "Change of plans," he said, his voice urgent. "What is it?" "Silas isn't running the show anymore," Elias said, checking the load in his Winchester. "Finch is here, personally." Abigail went pale. "Tobias? He never leaves the city. He hates the cold. He must hate the idea of hanging more," Elias said. "He's brought a posse, 10 men, and they have tracking dogs." Abigail looked at the dense forest around them. "Dogs? We can't outrun dogs in this snow." "No," Elias agreed. "We can't outrun them." He looked at the towering peaks to the west. The pass was treacherous, known as the Widowmaker by the locals. It was steep, prone to avalanches, and practically suicide in winter. "We have to go up," Elias said, pointing to the jagged peaks. "Over the spine of the range. The dogs can't scent on ice, and the horses won't follow where we're going." "Over the mountain?" Abigail asked, looking at the formidable wall of rock. "Is that possible? For a mountain man?" "Yes," Elias said. He grabbed her by the shoulders. "I need you to trust me, Abby. Truly trust me. If we slip, we die. If we stop, we die. But if we make it over, we drop right into the Green River Basin, and we lose them for good." Abigail looked into his gray eyes. She saw the fear there, but also the resolve. She realized she had fallen in love with this man somewhere between the biscuits and the bullets. "I trust you," she said. "Lead the way." Elias nodded. He slapped Samson on the rump, sending the horse galloping down the valley floor, creating a false trail to lead the posse south. Then, taking Abigail's hand, he turned toward the vertical face of the mountain. "Don't look down," he said. The wind on the face of the mountain didn't just blow. It stripped the heat from their bodies with the precision of a butcher's knife. Elias led the way, kicking toeholds into the hard-packed crust of the snow, creating a ladder for Abigail. They were 3,000 feet above the timberline. The air was thin, making every breath a ragged gasp. Abigail's hands were wrapped in strips of blanket Elias had cut, but she could no longer feel her fingers. She moved on instinct, placing her foot exactly where Elias had stepped, her eyes fixed on the back of his buffalo coat. "Don't stop," Elias shouted over the gale. "You stop, you die." Abigail gritted her teeth. Her legs burned as if filled with molten lead. She wanted to lie down. The white snow looked so soft, like a feather bed. But then she looked up and saw Elias. He was a machine, a force of nature driving them upward. He turned back, his beard crusted with ice, his eyes fierce and demanding. He wasn't just climbing for himself, he was climbing for her. She forced her boot into the next hold. "I can cook," she thought, a delirious mantra. "I can cook, I can survive, I can climb." They reached a narrow ledge, barely 2 feet wide, that hugged the cliff face. Below them, a drop of 2,000 feet into a canyon of jagged rocks. Above, the summit loomed, a crown of ice. "Rest," Elias rasped, pressing his back against the granite wall. He pulled Abigail close, shielding her from the wind with his massive body. He pulled a piece of frozen jerky from his pocket. "Chew," he ordered. "Keep your jaw moving." Abigail chewed the leather-like meat. "Did we lose them?" Elias looked down the mountain. He pulled out his brass telescope. The valley below was a miniature world of white and green. His jaw tightened. No. Through the lens, he saw them. Tiny black specks moving up the snowfield they had just crossed. Men on foot. They had abandoned their horses and were following the tracks. Finch is paying them well, Elias muttered. They shouldn't be risking this climb. How far behind? An hour, maybe less. Elias put the telescope away. They have fresh legs. We're tired. He looked at the snowpack above them. It was heavy, laden with fresh drifts from the storm, hanging precariously over the ledge. We have to trigger the slide, Elias said softly. Abigail looked at him in horror. An avalanche? Elias, that will kill us too. Not if we're in the chimney. He pointed to a vertical crack in the rock face about 50 yards ahead. It was a natural fissure, deep enough to hide in. We get to that chimney. We wait for them to reach the snowfield. Then I fire a shot. It's suicide, she whispered. It's the only way, Elias said. He cupped her face in his frozen hands. I promised I'd get you to Cheyenne. I don't break promises. They moved. The 50 yards to the chimney felt like 50 miles. The wind screamed, trying to tear them off the ledge. Twice, Abigail slipped, her boots scrabbling on the ice, and twice Elias caught her by the back of her coat, hauling her back with a grunt of exertion. They reached the fissure. It was a narrow vertical cave, barely deep enough for 2 people. They squeezed inside, the rock pressing against their chests. Elias checked his Winchester. He stripped off his gloves, needing the tactile sensitivity for the trigger. His fingers were blue. Wait, he whispered. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Then they appeared. Silas was in the lead, climbing with a pickaxe. Behind him, Tobias Finch struggled, his expensive coat looking out of place in this savage wilderness. 3 other men followed. They reached the middle of the open snowfield, directly beneath the heavy overhang of snow. Now, Elias whispered. He stepped out of the fissure, raised the rifle, and aimed not at the men, but at the cornice of snow hanging 200 feet above them. Crack. The sound of the rifle shot was swallowed instantly by a deep, groaning rumble. It sounded like the mountain itself was waking up. Silas looked up. He screamed something, but it was lost in the roar. The cornice broke. A wall of white, thousands of tons of snow and ice, detached from the peak. It didn't fall. It flowed, like a white river of destruction. Elias dove back into the fissure, grabbing Abigail and pulling her to the ground. He covered her body with his own, burying his face in her neck. The world turned to thunder. The air pressure dropped so sharply it popped their ears. Snow blasted past the opening of their hideout, a deafening freight train of ice. The ground shook violently. Darkness swallowed them, as the snow piled up against the opening, sealing them in. For a minute, there was only the roar. Then, silence. Absolute, suffocating silence. Abigail was shaking uncontrollably. Are we buried? Yes, Elias said in the dark. But we have air. The rock protects us. He pushed upward. The snow blocking the entrance was loose. He dug with his hands, shoving the white powder aside. A beam of sunlight broke through. They crawled out. The ledge was gone. The snowfield was gone. Where the men had been standing, the mountain was scoured clean down to the gray bedrock. The avalanche had swept everything. Finch, Silas, the posse. Down into the abyss of the canyon, buried under 100 feet of concrete-hard snow. Elias stood up, breathing heavily. He looked down into the white void. It's done, he said. Abigail stood beside him, her legs trembling. She didn't look down. She looked at him. You did it, she whispered. Elias turned to her. The adrenaline was fading, and the exhaustion was crashing in. We still have to get down. The other side. He took a step and stumbled. Abigail caught him. The mountain man, the invincible wolf, was faltering. Lean on me, Abigail said, surprising herself with the command in her voice. You carried me up, Elias. I'm walking you down. He looked at her with a new expression. It wasn't just protection anymore. It was respect. Yes, ma'am, he murmured. 3 days later, a ghostly pair rode a stolen nag bustling streets of Cheyenne. They looked like apparitions from a nightmare. Elias was gaunt, his beard matted, his buffalo coat torn. Abigail was sunburnt and wine-chapped, wearing rags wrapped around her boots. But in her hands, she clutched the canvas sack containing the black ledger. People stopped on the boardwalks to stare. A carriage driver pulled his horses up to avoid hitting them. Where is the courthouse? Elias rasped to a passerby. The man pointed dumbly down the main avenue. They rode to the brick building that served as the seat of justice for the territory. Elias slid off the horse, his knees buckling. He caught himself on the hitching post. He helped Abigail down. They walked up the steps, arm in arm, supporting each other. The courtroom was in session. Judge Holloway, a man with white mutton chops and a stern demeanor, was presiding over a land dispute. The doors banged open. Every head in the room turned. The bailiff reached for his gun, but stopped when he saw Elias's eyes. "Judge Holloway," Elias said. His voice was a croak, but it carried to the back of the room. The judge squinted over his spectacles. "Who interrupts my court?" "Elias Graham," he said. "Former deputy marshal." A murmur went through the crowd. The name was known. Elias guided Abigail forward. She walked to the bench, her head held high despite her rags. She slammed the black ledger onto the judge's desk. Dust motes danced in the air. "This," Abigail announced, her voice clear and ringing, "is the death warrant of the Tobias Finch Consortium." "Finch?" The judge frowned. "Tobias Finch is a pillar of this territory. Tobias Finch is dead," Elias said grimly, "buried under the Teton ice, along with his hired killers. That book tells you why." Judge Holloway opened the ledger. He adjusted his glasses. He read the first page, then the second. His face went pale. He looked up at the bailiff. "Close the doors," Holloway ordered. "No one leaves. Get the U.S. attorney. Now." The weeks that followed were a blur of depositions, telegraphs, and newspaper headlines. The Ledger of Laramie became the biggest scandal in the West. The mining consortium was dismantled. Claims were returned to widows and prospectors. Abigail Ross was hailed not as a thief, but as a heroine who brought down a tyrant. But Abigail didn't care about the headlines. She sat on the porch of a small boarding house on the edge of town. It was spring now. The snow was melting, feeding the green shoots of the prairie grass. She heard the heavy tread of boots on the wood planks. Elias stood there. He was clean-shaven, save for a trimmed mustache. He wore a new suit, ill-fitting across his broad shoulders, and a clean Stetson. He looked uncomfortable. "They gave me the reward money," Elias said, holding out a bank draft. $500, and the bounty on Silas. It's a lot of money. Abigail looked at the paper, then up at him. "You earned it." "I'm going back," Elias said. Abigail's heart stopped. "Back to the cabin?" "To the mountains," he said. "I bought a plot of land, near the Green River. Good timber, good water, not so high up that the winter kills you." "Sounds lonely," Abigail said, her voice tight. Elias stepped closer. He took off his hat, twisting the brim in his hands. "I can build a cabin," he said. "Better than the last one. Proper windows. A real floor." He looked at her, his gray eyes vulnerable for the first time. "But I can't cook," he said. "Not like you. I tried." Biscuits came out like rocks. Abigail stood up. A smile slowly spread across her face, bright as the Wyoming sun. "You need a cook, Elias Graham?" "No," Elias said, dropping the hat. He stepped forward and took her hands. "I need you. I need the woman who walked through hell and didn't flinch. I need Abigail." "I don't come cheap," she teased, tears pricking her eyes. "I'll give you everything," he promised. "Every sunrise, every hunt, every breath I have left." He pulled her close, and this time there was no hesitation. He kissed her, and it tasted like coffee and spring rain and survival. "I'll pack my skillet," Abigail whispered against his lips. "You do that," Elias smiled. "I'll saddle the horses." They rode out of Cheyenne an hour later, heading west toward the setting sun and the mountains that were no longer a prison, but a home. And that, my friends, is the legend of the Ledger and the Mountain Man. It's a reminder that sometimes the hardest journeys lead us exactly where we need to be, and that even in the coldest winter, love can burn bright enough to save us. If you enjoyed Abigail and Elias's story, please smash that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Subscribe and hit the bell notification so you don't miss our next Wild West saga. And tell me in the comments, would you have risked the avalanche or taken your chances with the posse? Thanks for listening, and I'll see you on the next trail.